Hello and welcome back to the Champagne Anarchism read-through of Capitalism, A Ghost Story by Arundhati Roy. We are doing chapters 4 to 6 today. So if you haven't gone through the original chapters and the intro video that introduces this book, I recommend that you do that. You can find that on the Patreon channel at patreon.com/champagneanarchism. And we've got that full reading series up there. This is an incredible book, and if you've made it this far, congratulations. This is unfortunately going to close out this book, which is... It feels really fast. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. It is a pretty short book and pretty reader friendly, but it's still kind of sad to see it go by so quickly. So yeah, it's exciting to be able to close this out, but it's also a little bit bittersweet because we'll be leaving Arundhati Roy and her work behind. Obviously, for the rest of the reading series, we will continue to refer to this book, I'm sure, because a lot of the ideas in this book really carry forward and are still extremely important now. But, you know, let's just dig right into it and close out Arundhati Roy so we can get started on the next book, which is going to be Herman and Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. If you haven't read this book, I so highly recommend you come around and check out this reading series because I really, this is a formative book for me. This is an extremely important book and I highly recommend it. But without further ado, let's get into Roy. Now, chapters 4, 5, and 6 actually flow quite well together because they can be all kind of summed up with one main statement, and that is that human rights, legal rights, and legal protections in a nation only really matter when they're convenient for the powerful. And if pushed, these rights will fall away immediately. And we start, of course, with chapter 4. This is Kashmir's Fruits of Discord. In the last section, the last lecture on this, we talked a lot about Kashmir, and we're going to talk a lot more about Kashmir today because it is so important to framing Arundhati Roy's thought. And remember that she, in her capacity as a journalist, is going in to talk to people, to actually understand what's going on the ground, which puts her in a bit of a privileged position because as we will see, as we get further into this lecture, there's been a major crackdown on people reporting from and about Kashmir. And so actually getting good, reliable information out of the region is extremely difficult. So Roy is a very clear voice in this respect, and it's another good reason to dig in and really appreciate and read her work, I think. So anyway, Kashmir's Fruits of Discord, we start with Barack Obama, very disappointingly, who back in 2008, when he was campaigning, he said that resolving Kashmir's dispute would be among his critical tasks. And when he actually took office, of course, somehow, mysteriously, that campaign promise just got sort of pushed to the back burner. And Roy speculates that his sort of judicious silence may have had a lot to do with the $5.8 billion order for Boeing aircraft that India's government put in. So we should say about Kashmir. Kashmir is one of the most militarized zones in the world. Back when Arundhati Roy was writing this back in 2015, that probably was the most militarized zone in the world. Now, it may be a little bit tougher to pin that down because obviously we have the occupied Gaza and the West Bank. It's tough to actually say, and it's also tough to pin down exactly how many troops are in Kashmir. This is another major problem. Getting good data out of the region is also weirdly difficult. Considering India is a very powerful and very modern nation with a lot of great data collection, you would think this would not be that tough to get a good number on, but we can say thousands of military personnel in the region, and we can also say that thousands of people have disappeared. This is straight from Roy. Thousands of people have disappeared and more have fled, she says. But Roy says that people are willing to fight, and when she was writing, students were taking to the streets. They were appearing kind of leaderless. This should maybe remind us of some of the COVID protests in places like Chile or Colombia, when students just came out en masse to protests kind of general conditions in the country, and that, again, quite leaderless and extremely spontaneous, and that makes it simultaneously very difficult to address concerns that aren't kind of concentrated, but also very difficult to actually stop them because they are so spontaneous. And so just as Colombia did, India had to turn to just downright repression to get the protests under control and fully militarize even further this incredibly sensitive zone in India. So in this essay, and this is probably my favorite essay in the book, by the way, because it is so beautifully written, and the end of this essay is really what gets me every time. Some people find it corny, this ending, but I think that it is so heartfelt and wonderful that it is such a powerful way to just end this essay here. And we'll get into the exact quote in a second. But basically, she goes to speak with Shakil Ahmed Ahangar. The Indian army has raped and murdered his wife and his sister. And in the process of this, they've tried to sweep it under the rug. Roy has already written about this. She's going back to further investigate, to talk to more people, to really better understand what's recently been going on with this case, and to kind of just speak to people in the region. And it's getting dark and it's getting late, and she's just made some comments in the press about Kashmir, and so she knows she's in a lot of hot water, a very difficult situation, and so she's kind of followed on her way out by a car. And this car stops. She thinks it's probably the security services, but the car stops, and the father of Shakil's murdered wife comes out and gives apples and boiled eggs to Roy. This is apple season in Kashmir, which, if you've seen any pictures of Kashmir, you know that Kashmir is beautiful. And by the way, if you're following along with our culture series, that is unfortunately behind a paywall on Patreon, but if you really want this episode, please get in touch and I can just send it to you directly. If you feel like you can't afford that for any reason, that's totally fine. But on the cultural series, we talked about a movie called Haider. Haider is a modern retelling in sort of a Bollywood style of Hamlet, and it takes place in Kashmir. And you see, because a lot of sections were filmed in Kashmir, you see the beauty of Kashmir, just this region. It's absolutely stunning. Anyway, situate yourself a little bit in this. It's apple picking season in Kashmir, and the father of this murdered woman gives crates of apples to Roy, saying, "You can't leave before we've given you some Kashmiri apples and some boiled eggs." He kind of presses these warm eggs into her hand, and she ends on this note of really incredible optimism, and I just think it's beautiful. She says, quote, "Indian nationalists and the government seem to believe that they can fortify their idea of a resurgent India with a combination of bullying and Boeing airplanes, but they don't understand the subversive strength of warm boiled eggs." If that isn't just a stunning way to end an essay, and a reminder, I keep coming back to this, I know I keep coming back to this, but the fact that Arundhati Roy can write. I mean, man, can she write. We won't read a writer as good as her, at least in this early section of this book club, because, you know, Frantz Fanon is a brilliant writer as well, but he doesn't capture the feeling the way that Arundhati Roy can, and it is because she is from this novelistic background, and she sees this interplay between the novel, fiction, and nonfiction writing. She often says that, you know, fiction is the truest thing that was ever said, and that is true in her case. Now, since this essay, and we should mention a lot of this before we get into the rest of our discussion of Kashmir, but since this essay was published in 2015, or this essay collection, I should say, was published in 2015, in 2019, Narendra Modi, who's the current prime minister, removed Article 370 from the Indian Constitution. This was actually last year. I'm recording this in 2024, if you're watching this from the future. This was upheld last year by the Supreme Court. And that Article 370 retained some kind of nominal degree of autonomy for Jammu and Kashmir, which previously had a degree of self-government and self-control and just autonomy. There no longer is any state legislature. They're governed directly from the capital, from New Delhi. There was a crackdown on reporters and activists in the region, and it also removed, very interestingly and maybe most perniciously, it removed a number of protections that were meant to help kind of local Kashmiri residents. So now outsiders can come in and buy property in the region. A specific amount of time, depending on who you are, but a specific amount of time spent living in Kashmir will confer permanent settled status and kind of permanent residence that entitles you to certain things in the region. And so you can see this kind of erosion in the area. And a lot of people who look at this allege that this is a direct attempt by the Modi administration to engineer some kind of demographic change. This is a bit of India that is Muslim majority, and so opening it up to foreigners and allowing this permanent residence status and removing a degree of autonomy, it kind of opens it up to some kind of potential shift if that is something that the government wants to encourage. And leave all that aside, just removing that degree of autonomy and that self-government is already kind of a blow to the region. If you want more detail on this, by the way, there's a very, very good explainer that Al Jazeera wrote about this that explains a little bit of what has happened in India since the 2019 removal of Article 370. I highly recommend you just go check that out. It will give you an extremely good summary. But that is just a little bit of background for this conversation that we're about to have here. So moving on from chapter 4 and that brilliant, beautiful ending of chapter 4. But chapter 5 is called A Perfect Day for Democracy. And this chapter, and in fact the next chapter, are all about the secret hanging of Afzal Guru. Now, Afzal Guru was accused of an attack on the Parliament of India in 2001. This was a very high-profile case. This is people trying to smuggle in an improvised explosive device that ends up going off, kills several people. And so the Indian government goes on a really intense hunt for people who may have been involved, who may have been planning, who may have helped carry out this attack. And they find this guy who is a Kashmiri militant, Afzal Guru. But Roy says that the case against Guru is was incredibly shaky. The main evidence of his involvement wasn't sealed, and so it might have been planted. There's kind of a mountain of lies and fabricated evidence in the case that keeps coming up, and the cops get away with just kind of a slap on the wrist for this massive procedural mistake. And Roy notes that Afzal Guru was kind of just a nobody. Again, we said he's a Kashmiri militant, but he's also the victim in this case of blackmail, torture, extortion at the hands of his government, and in the end he was killed for it. And so Roy really makes the point in this essay that the Indian government and police wrongfully hanged this man because they judged that he just didn't matter. And it would satisfy this kind of popular bloodlust. Now, remember that theme that I set out right at the beginning, that we assume ourselves to have all these protections. In a modern democracy, and India is certainly a modern democracy, we assume that we have protection under the law. We assume that there are procedures and institutions and things that have built up that we can take advantage of in a situation like this, right? We assume that the cops will protect us. We assume that the legal system will do its job. We assume that we will not be put to death for a crime that we haven't committed. We assume this kind of thing that underpins the entire legal system, which is innocent until proven guilty, still holds and always will hold. And you may be listening to me talk about this and say, well, yeah, you can assume that you're white, or you're at least very white presenting. And that is true, because a lot of people who exist on the margins of the US society, for example, already know this. A lot of people who don't fit the kind of received notion of what we're supposed to look like know that you can't call the cops in a time of emergency, that the legal system cannot be trusted to do its job, and that you can very easily be executed or go to prison when you have done nothing wrong, right? Innocent people are found on death row all the time. This happens kind of a lot. And so this is just Arundhati Roy kind of prodding us through the pages here and reminding us that these things that we think are enshrined, right? These things, these human rights, these legal protections, habeas corpus, whatever it is, that actually works. She's here to remind us that it doesn't. That if you are put in a situation where it behooves the powerful to remove those protections from you, they will remove them immediately. And that it happens all the time. And if it can happen to Afzal Guru, it can happen to anybody. And so the point that she makes in this essay is that Afzal Guru was just a man who was pushed through the system because India needed somebody to hang. And so he was the most convenient thing. So regardless of anything, any procedural, evidential problems they may have had, it didn't matter. He was just convenient and he was there. And by the way, that they hung him in secret, which brings us to our next essay, chapter 6, which is the consequences of hanging Afzal Guru. Now, Roy starts this essay by noting that Guru's family was never given their legal right to appeal, as the notice of his execution was sent after his death. And she makes a big deal of this, as she should. right? She says his son was never allowed to speak to his father to get those last words of fatherly advice, things like that. The fact that this happened to this family is sufficient to say this case is absurd and vile and a tremendous miscarriage of justice from the start. But then after that, Roy notes that there were new protests after Afzal Guru was hung. These mass protests that kicked off in Kashmir, which were just used as an excuse to further crack down and further militarize the border. Now, the crucial thing to understand here is that Guru was a Kashmiri militant, but he was linked to Pakistan. So India, if it wants to militarize or crack down on dissent in Kashmir, it will blame its consistent geopolitical rival, which is Pakistan. And Pakistan has, of course, many times financed militant insurgents in Kashmir. That happens, kind of also a lot. And so this is another thing that can happen with this hanging, which is that India can take its geopolitical rival down a peg and blame a boogeyman in this situation. They have their scapegoat, and any failures of the Indian government are sort of swept under the rug in this respect. So protests kick off. And one of the things that Roy says about these protests is that, as opposed to some of the optimism of the mass uprisings in 2008, 2009, 2010, these protests were quite cold. They were corrosive. They were carried out by people who had been living under occupation and understood the reality of the situation. And Afzal Guru's case only helped to fortify that in their minds, that this is an unwinnable situation, that you are up against something that will not change fundamentally. And so the optimism of those earlier protests just kind of dissipated. She has this incredible quote here. She says, "For more than 20 years, Kashmiris have endured a military occupation. The tens of thousands who lost their lives were killed in prisons, in torture centers, and in encounters, genuine as well as fake. What sets the execution of Afzal Guru apart is that it has given the young, who have never had any first-hand experience of democracy, a ringside seat to watch the full majesty of Indian democracy at work." This is angry. This essay and the one before it come from a place of kind of pure rage. You can feel it, again, in the writing that comes through here. If chapter 4 ended on that optimistic note, that note of kind of hope, those warm boiled eggs that were pressed into Arundhati Roy's hands that gave her such hope in that moment, this is Arundhati Roy kind of coming back to earth and bringing us this reality that is just so bitter and cold and corrosive. The word that she uses here, corrosive, as these kids who have never experienced true democracy come up against the machine and are ground up against it. And from here, Roy goes into a very interesting thing that I think we should give a lot more background to. She says that, all of this has been blamed on Pakistan, but Kashmir has long been kind of this plaything between India and Pakistan. Nobody really cares about the Kashmiris. Nobody really cares about the region, despite the protestations on both sides. Really, this is just a chess piece in a struggle between these two geopolitical rivals, and the consequences have been dire for the Kashmiri people, who are just trying to exist. And so Roy very rightly brings up, yes, Pakistan has intervened before in Kashmir, but India intervenes in Pakistani affairs all the time. And a lot of these operate, we should say, through this notorious research and analysis wing, the RAW, which is India's kind of intelligence agency. It's their equivalent, basically, of the CIA in this respect. And a lot of these operations happen through their auspices. She mentions, for example, the operations in Balochistan. This refers to Pakistan's southwest province, although Balochistan is as an area, it also kind of encompasses bits of Iran and Afghanistan as well. And this conflict, at least on the Pakistani side in Balochistan, is drawn along ethnic lines, so between the Baloch minority and the Punjabi majority. And so this is often an ethnic struggle in this region. And there are allegations, some of them seem credible, that India may have covertly interfered here or even financed some of the terrorist groups. And Roy clearly buys these allegations. And also, knowing a lot of the actions of the Indian government and the way that the RAW operates, I would be surprised if they weren't true, if there wasn't some degree of truth to these allegations of India's involvement in the militants in Balochistan. Now the other thing, and these are kind of tossed off very quickly by Roy in this section, but I actually think they deserve a lot more analysis, so that's why I'm going a little bit more in depth into these incidents, because they are so important to have in the back of our mind. When we consider Kashmir as a plaything between these two global powers, we sort of have to understand a little bit more of the context here. The other thing that she mentions is the Mukti Bakini. This refers to Operation Jackpot in 1971, where India trained a guerrilla resistance movement in what was then East Pakistan. So a little bit of history. After partition in 1947, Pakistan ends up in West Pakistan and East Pakistan. East Pakistan ends up being Bangladesh, but that only happens after a very bitter war. It's often referred to, and this language also should give you a little bit of an indication of the spin that's been put on this, but it led to the Bangladesh Liberation War, is typically how it's referred to. And Operation Jackpot in 71 is training and arming and financing and pushing up this militant resistance in East Pakistan to kind of harry West Pakistan and create this movement that will eventually lead to the separation of Pakistan. Remember, there's a huge rivalry after partition. 1947 is characterized by this mad scramble for territory and just votes and invasions, which, by the way, happened in Kashmir, which initially under Hari Singh was supposed to be independent, but then there was an invasion, and so they had to capitulate and come mostly into the arms of India. But this culminates in 1972, a year after this operation, which eventually successfully creates the modern nation of Bangladesh. So that's a little bit of the history there. Now, that's not to say that this was necessarily a manufactured conflict and Bangladesh didn't have a local homegrown resistance. None of that's true. But there was a significant amount of Indian intervention and later downright war. The other thing that Roy mentions is the Sri Lankan Tamil insurgent groups, including the LTTE, that's the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, and they fought to create an independent state in Sri Lanka. This eventually failed. It was the island of Sri Lanka, very much in the sphere of influence of not just India but also Pakistan. And in Sri Lanka, again along ethnic lines, there was a Tamil resistance against the Sinhalese majority group, and they wanted to create their own independent breakaway state. The LTTE ended up becoming just a downright terrorist group. That happened later, but they were financed and trained by India under Indira Gandhi. India actually eventually ended up sort of stranding them. It signed a cooperation agreement with Sri Lanka, and so ended up kind of leaving these revolutionaries that they had trained high and dry. And that culminated in an assassination of Rajiv Gandhi, Indira Gandhi's son, who was later also prime minister. This is a very powerful Indian political family, I should say, the Gandhis. This is not Mahatma Gandhi's family. This is actually Jawaharlal Nehru's family. His daughter is Indira Gandhi, separate Gandhi, and her son is Rajiv Gandhi, who becomes prime minister later on. And his son Rahul Gandhi actually is a huge politician in India now as well. So this is a very powerful family, and Rajiv Gandhi is assassinated. And so for him, this is sort of the chickens coming home to roost a little bit. This is, you have trained a militant guerrilla group and then let it free. This is very much an American tactic, by the way. We do this all the time. But this is the extremely militant group, the LTTE, that Arundhati Roy is referring to here. This is a creation of India. Now, coming back to this essay, a very interesting point that Roy makes with this essay is to say that whereas a lot of the indigenous resistance, and remember, Roy is very familiar with this, with the indigenous resistance, because she understands the struggles of the Naxalites, the Maoists in West Bengal. She understands the Kashmiri militants. Whereas a lot of these indigenous movements can be crushed very quickly and militarily, although some of them, of course, still exist, but through extremely brutal means. Roy notes that many of the protests in India now are coming more from the emerging middle class. These are more economically powerful people. These are more educated people. These are people that she says you can water cannon them, but you can't shoot them. You can't just imprison them en masse. This has to be dealt with in a more creative way. And her point back in 2015 was India's government doesn't really have a good way to do that. So what do you do if you can't easily control a population? Well, you redirect them. That's what Roy tells us. You redirect them towards another target, something else. You distract them. And she ends on this quote, and I also want to end on this quote here. She says, "What better solution than to aim a kick at that tried and trusted old political football, Kashmir?" So again, at the end of this book, at the end of everything, and I will do a follow-up video that tackles the conclusion along with some thoughts to keep in your mind about Arundhati Roy and her work and this book in particular. In the conclusion, she talks to Occupy students, by the way. It's very, very interesting. But at the end of this book, she ties it right back to Kashmir. So again, over the course of this book, we're being told the things that you think you had access to, the things that you thought were true, the things that you thought you could rely on. Your government saying this is a terrorist insurgency, or your government saying you have these human rights, habeas corpus works for you. This all ties together, which is just Roy saying, again, when the powerful need these protections to be removed, when the powerful need these people to be terrorists, when the powerful need to break open markets and they're going to use corporate philanthropy to do that, they're just going to do that. There is very little that you can do. And so Roy, in these essays, is telling us, listen, these are things to be resisted. These are things that should force us to kind of come together in solidarity with the people that are being affected by these things. This is not just a criticism of the Indian government. This is a criticism of the systems of power that we have built for ourselves around the world. That's Roy's kind of primary target at this. And remember that thing that I said a lecture or two ago when Roy talks about the death of imagination? This is Roy's sort of plea that we have to envision a better world and we have to work towards that. That the things that we think are constraining us are not actually constraints, that the Overton window has shifted so far in one direction that we need to shift it right the heck back. This is Roy's main point here, is that all of these things that we're told constantly are ridiculous and that we can't stand up to these power structures and that the police and the legal system are here to save us and help us and all of these things that we're told, they're not true. None of these things are actually true. And that is why I find Arundhati Roy's work so fascinating in this respect. Arundhati Roy is not an avowed anarchist, I should say. She's not an avowed anarchist. But a lot of her work does kind of lend itself to that kind of interpretation. Now, I say Roy isn't explicitly anarchist because, well, she does clearly have this kind of innate sense that power is a corrosive element in our society, and that great power corrupts, and at the core of every major government there is a deep corruption, and that we have to return back to the people. She is not explicitly building sort of an anarchist society that we should live in, that we should replace this with, anything like that. In fact, she's not really doing much positive construction of anything that could happen after we remove these systems whatsoever. It's a frequent and very fair criticism, I think, of her work, that she is an incredible critic, but what does she build after it? Now, my own personal thoughts on this, I don't think she needs to be anything more than a critic. I think that Roy is a tremendous critic, and that anything we can do against these systems of power that she describes is sufficient. That when it comes to resistance or positively building something afterwards, let a million flowers bloom, right? Anyway, that's my small rant at the end of Arundhati Roy's book. I hope you enjoyed these last few chapters, and I hope that you think about that moment of solidarity that lives in this book, in that fourth chapter, that expression of mutual support and mutual aid through crates of apples and Roy holding these warm boiled eggs in her hand. I hope that is the lasting image that you take away from this book, because that, I found to be truly beautiful and worthy of kind of our consideration here. So I will see you next week for the introductory lecture of manufacturing consent. I hope you have enjoyed this series. As always, please let me know what you think. And thank you very much. I'll see you next week.